In the previous video, we focused on contrasting and then combining the cultural and structural perspectives on social inequality. Now we're ready to begin examining the work of sociologist W.B. Du Bois more closely. Remember that Du Bois combines the structural and cultural perspectives together, so clearly he was very much concerned with structural oppression. We're going to learn about his approach to structural oppression when we get to conflict theory, because in order to understand it, you first have to learn about Marx. For now, I want to point out that what makes his work particularly distinctive is how he paired structural oppression with cultural oppression. So this will be our focus for now, but keep in mind that it fits together with structural oppression. Remember that a culture of prejudice and racism is created by those in power to legitimate the existing system of stratification. For Du Bois, cultural oppression is central to this process of justifying unequal opportunity structures. It involves three key mechanisms: exclusion from history, specific kinds of symbolic representations, and the use of stereotypes and their cultural logic as default assumptions. Let's start with the exclusion from history. For Du Bois, structural oppression, specifically economic and political oppression, is reinforced by cultural exclusion. In other words, cultural exclusion legitimates and facilitates structural oppression. African Americans, and by extension other oppressed racial groups, have been systematically excluded from U.S. history. These groups have even been deprived of their own cultural histories. History, the way we tell the story of this nation, plays an important part in legitimating our social structures. This function that history serves is known as history as ideology. Because we weren't there when it happened, history takes on an objective quality, and it feels like fact, like that's what happened, and so it can't really be disputed. This facticity legitimates our institutions and social arrangements to the point that most people don't question them. But, as Du Bois tells us, this history is written in such a way that legitimizes white privilege and the status quo. Because women and people of color were not seen as having the same status as white men, they were not included in our history and have become blind to their contributions and place in society. Du Bois calls this kind of exclusionary ideological history lies agreed upon. The second mechanism of cultural oppression has to do with symbolic representations. He recognized that meaning has to be constructed, and in the process, we use representational systems of concepts and ideas. So, representation is the symbolic practice through which meaning is given to the world around us. Representation involves the production and consumption of cultural ideas, and so it is a major site of conflict, negotiation, and potential oppression. An example that Du Bois presents has to do with media representations of people of color. He notes that, quote, "Whites obviously seldom picture brown and yellow folk, but for 500 years they have exhausted every ingenuity of trick, of ridicule and caricature on black folk when representing them at all." End quote. So the dominant group creates symbolic representations of those who are subjugated in such a way that negative meanings and myths are produced, myths that support the position of the oppressor. Think back to the concept of controlling images identified by sociologist Patricia Hill Collins. Her work and that of Du Bois line up very closely with one another, and this is one area where you can see the parallels. The effect of these kinds of representations is both cultural and psychological, in that the oppressed see these representations and may become ashamed of their own image. This kind of complex layering of ideological meanings is why members of an oppressed group can simultaneously be proud and ashamed of their heritage. These representations, or controlling images, focus on the group's shortcomings, and these images come to dominate the general culture as stereotypes. This brings us to the third mechanism involved in cultural oppression. In addition to historical erasure and misrepresentation, cultural oppression also consists of being defined as a problem. You'll remember we talked about this when I introduced the topic of white privilege. As Du Bois says, quote, "Between me and the other world, this is ever an unasked question. How does it feel to be a problem?" End quote. Because of their pervasiveness, these controlling images and representations are accepted even by members of the oppressed group, resulting in internalized racism, sexism, or homophobia. Here we can see one of the insidious ways in which cultural legitimation works. It presents us with an apparent truth that once we agree to it, can reflexively destroy us. In this way, oppressed groups come to see themselves from at least two, often contradictory perspectives. In the case of African Americans, individuals internalize their own group-specific culture, but at the same time, people internalize the cultural images produced by the ruling white culture. The result is what Du Bois termed double consciousness, which we examined at the beginning of the semester. So now we have a general theory of cultural oppression. Overall, every group that is oppressed structurally, meaning economically and politically, will also be oppressed culturally in order to justify and legitimate that structural inequality. It begins by defining and labeling the group in general as a problem. In so doing, the oppressing group emphasizes and stereotypes the group's shortcomings and defines them as intrinsic to the group. The oppressors employ cultural representations and splash them everywhere so that these negative attributes are taken for granted, even by the oppressed themselves. Finally, you systematically exclude the group from the grand narrative histories of the larger society, erasing their contributions as if the oppressed were never there.